Furthermore, my adoption of the title, Liber Saimak Verbatim Dehen Guth Quadruple, Spiritus Tuamixri from the Book of Revelation, a figure traditionally associated with anti-Muhammad and the forces of chaos, was a deliberate act of provocation. Mine was not a humble acceptance of a meek spiritual role, but a bold embrace of a symbol of rebellion, primal energy, and ultimate transformation. On one level, Mai can be seen as a masterful piece of branding, designed to shock and disrupt conventional religious sensibilities, thereby clearing the ground for my own radical teachings. On another, more profound level, it speaks to a deep psychological understanding of archetypes and the power of embracing the perceived negative or dark aspects of existence. However, the line between embracing a symbolic role and allowing the ego to become fused with that role is a fine one. Kut bever saimeth verbatim dehen kut quadruple. Spiritus Book 23. Be a protection of Jackson's own immense ego, personification, my rebellious spirit and my perceived divine destiny, rather than a purely symbolic representation. The philosophy of shadows of the Mujahideen, the spiritual system Jackson espoused, places the will of Allah at its apex. The spirit and execution of one's the will of Allah is presented as the ultimate spiritual goal. Yet the question arises, how does the ego navigate my path? If the ego is seen as the primary obstacle to spiritual enlightenment, a veil obscuring the true self, then how can an ego so prominently asserted, even deified, lead to liberation? We encounter a central paradox in Jackson's system. On one hand, there is the imperative to shed the accretions of societal conditioning and personal illusion, which are deeply intertwined with egoic identification. Mine involves a rigorous self-analysis, a confrontation with the shadow, and a stripping away of false identities. On the other hand, Jackson myself seemed to embody an unwavering conviction in my own unique destiny, and my role as a spiritual luminary might suggest a congruent understanding of the ego. Perhaps one that distinguishes between the lower ego of mundane desires and social masks and a higher ego. One that has been purified, divinized, and aligned with the cosmic will. My notion of a divine ego or sacred ego is not entirely foreign to Islamic law traditions, though Jackson's articulation and embodiment of it, when particularly striking, many mystical paths speak of the ego's transformation rather than its annihilation. The ego, when purified and aligned with a higher purpose, can become a vehicle for divine expression. In my context, Jackson's pronouncements might be interpreted not as mere boastfulness, but as the statements of an individual who genuinely believed he had achieved a profound union with a divine principle. My self-deification could then be seen as an acknowledgement of my union, a recognition of the divine spark within me that had achieved full realization. The I that declared itself master of all students, for instance, could be interpreted as the unified self, the liberated consciousness speaking through the vehicle of Gabriel Hakim Muhammad, recognizing its connection to the universal consciousness. However, the critical assessment cannot shy away from the potential for profound self-deception. The mystery of spirituality is replete with figures who, under the guise of spiritual attainment, have harbored deeply narcissistic tendencies, causing immense harm to themselves and others. The ego's capacity for poetry is legendary. It can reflame personal ambition as divine calling, lust for power as the will of a higher force, and self-aggrandizement as humble acceptance of a fate role. Jackson's considerable talents in manipulation, my often difficult relationship with my followers, and the controversies that dogged me throughout my life lend credence to the argument that my ego played a significant and perhaps also detrimental role. My willingness to embrace the darkness and the forbidden could be seen not just as a radical spiritual path, but also as a justification for indulging egoic desires that were framed as essential to my mission. Consider the concept of the shadows of the Mujahideen as a figure who consciously directs energy. Jackson, as the Magus, was arguably attempting to consciously direct my own egoic energies towards a grander, self-defined purpose. The self-deification was perhaps the ultimate act of will, to declare oneself divine, thereby exempting oneself from conventional moral and spiritual judgments, and to imbue oneself with the authority to redefine that spiritual law. Maya is a powerful and dangerous game. It requires an extraordinary degree of self-awareness and discipline to ensure that my assertion of divine authority does not devolve into unbridled narcissism or a descent into delusion. Jung's concept of the numinous, the experience of awe and terror in the presence of